Previously, bodyguard Rhea falls for heiress Celeste as ghosts from her Black Ops past strike. After an ambush, they choose love and set a trap. For part 1, link is in the description. Not of the danger, not of the blood, not even of losing. Because this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about not letting love slip through their hands again. And when Rhea whispered, "Stay close, don't run, don't argue," Celeste just nodded and said, "I'm not leaving you. Not now, not ever." And Rhea let that be enough. At 3:16 a.m., the sensors picked up movement heat signatures just outside the perimeter. Exactly. As planned, Rhea was already dressed. Weapon loaded, her mind a map of possibilities. She glanced out the window and spotted them 4 in total. Not 5, not 6. Exactly 4, which meant they were either sure of themselves or reckless or, worse, both. They moved with military discipline. Black tactical kits, suppressed carbines. No sound, no pause, phantoms, like she used to be. She pivoted toward Celeste, who stood by the fireplace in her coat, eyes wide yet steady. Rhea stepped close, hands framing her face. "If anything happens to me, you follow the plan. Nova Calder will extract you. You vanish. Don't wait for me. Don't come back for me. Swear it. Mean it. Celeste, mean it." "No," Celeste said, her voice breaking. "Don't ask me to live without you." "I have to," Rhea said. "I need to know you'll make it even if I don't." "Then you'd better return to me," Celeste whispered, and kissed her hard, quick, like armor. Rhea turned and slid into position, crouching at the door. Heart a metronome of ice and fire, breath even, nerves locked, focus razor sharp, grip steady. Then she waited. The front door creaked, the first mistake too soon, too fast. They had underestimated her. Rhea counted 1 beat, then another, then moved like lightning. The first round was clean. A throat. The body dropped silent. The others scattered into defensive angles. Rhea moved again, firing from behind cover, driving them into the corridor, splitting them. She tracked every step, every breath, every shadow, every echo skittering along plaster and glass. Celeste stayed hidden, watching the camera feeds the way Rhea had taught her, eyes wide, fingers shaking, but ready. Rhea dropped the second man with a close shot to the leg, then the neck. The third tried to sweep from the rear window, but she'd set a surprise there. Tripwire, flashbang. He screamed, and she ended it quick. The last one was different. She knew it before she saw him. His steps were too quiet, too precise. When he stepped into the light, she stilled. "Hello, Rhea," he said, the voice she hadn't heard in 7 years. The voice of the man who forged her into what she was. "Ronan Pike," she breathed, and it felt like poison on her tongue. "I told them not to send you, but you knew they would." He smiled without mirth. His face, older, thinner, carried the same hunger. "You trained me too well." "This isn't who I am anymore," she said, gun up but fingers shaking. "But it's who I am, and you taught me this. You don't outrun blood, Rhea. It dries, but it doesn't vanish. I won't let you touch her. I don't want her. I want you. Walk out with me now. Finish the job, and we disappear again. Clean. New names, new lives, like before. I don't want that life. I want air that isn't rented by death. It's the only one you were ever great at." Rhea looked past him a beat, saw Celeste on the monitor, watching, eyes bright with unshed tears. And Rhea thought about love, about fire, about the woman who kissed her like survival, and said, "No care inside." "Then that's a pity." He moved fast, a smear of black and death. They collided hard, brutal, trained. Rhea barely parried the first knife strike, turned, and countered, her elbow to his jaw, his knee to her ribs. Pain flowered. She didn't stop. Breath ragged, visions sparking, she drove through the hurt. She fought with everything she had, because she wasn't just fighting to live. She was fighting for her choice, for her future, for Celeste. Ronan Pike pinned her to the wall, hand at her throat, and whispered, This is the last time you pick someone over the work. Then a shot cracked close loud. Celeste stood in the doorway, eyes wide, hands steady, the gun smoking. Ronan Pike reeled, blood blooming from his shoulder. Rhea moved on instinct, wrenching the blade from his fist and sending him to the floor. She stood over him, chest heaving, blood streaking her cheek, and said, "You're right about one thing, I am good at this." Then she dropped him cold, turned to Celeste, who stood frozen. "You shot him," Rhea said. Celeste let the gun fall, eyes wide. "I had to." Rhea seized her, held her so tightly she thought they might collapse. "You saved my life, so we're even," Celeste breathed. That night, they burned the evidence, called Nova Calder, said it was time, packed what little they owned, and slipped into the dark. No farewells, no trail, just a memory of fire and blood and a love that refused to die. They vanished the way ghosts do, not with sirens, not with speeches, but with a silence so absolute it swallowed everything they had been. The world never learned what happened in that cabin. No reports, no names, no aftermath, just a blip in the system, and then nothing. And that nothing became everything because inside it, Rhea and Celeste could finally breathe. They surfaced in northern Iceland under fresh names, papers, and shadows. The air there was cold and clean and cutting. It tasted like slate and sea salt, like starting over. They found a small town where no one asked questions too loudly, and no one cared if you arrived with a duffel of old scars. Rhea barely spoke for the first 3 days. Not much, at least just yes, no, here, there. Celeste didn't push. She gave her room, filled the cabin with quiet rituals, warmth from a fire, tea steeping, bread from the market, and slow glances that said, "I'm here, and I'm not leaving." And Rhea started breathing again, not just in the lungs, but somewhere deeper, somewhere she'd locked up for years. The nightmares came at first, sharp, brutal, real. She'd wake up choking on memories of Ronan Pike's voice, of glass breaking, of blood warm and slick in her hands. And every time Celeste was there holding her, whispering things that didn't fix it, but soften it. Rhea would sit on the floor, legs pulled to her chest, and say, "I don't know how to be alive without running." And Celeste would answer, "Then stop running, and I'll stay still with you." And that became their promise, not to erase the past, but to survive it together. The first time Rhea touched her again, it wasn't planned. They were outside the town, walking a trail that led to the cliffs above the water. The wind was brutal to see below, roaring with fury. And Rhea looked at it like it made sense, like her insides matched that chaos. And Celeste watched her not with fear but with understanding, and said, "You don't have to hold it all alone." And Rhea said, "I don't know how to let go." And Celeste said, "Then start small," and held out her hand. Rhea took it, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she was and didn't want to be anymore. And that night in their bed, Rhea kissed her again, not with fire this time, but with reverence, like "Thank you," like "I missed you," like "Please don't let me break." And they moved together, slow, desperate, gentle, the way two people do when they're learning to breathe through someone else. Rhea whispered, "I thought I'd lost this in me." And Celeste said, "You didn't lose it. It was waiting." And Rhea almost cried. But didn't she? Just held her tighter. They built a life, not perfect, not easy, but real. Rhea got a job fixing boats under a man who didn't speak English and didn't care that she rarely spoke at all. Celeste started painting again. Canvases filled the walls, images of oceans and glass and faces half lit like memory. They didn't talk about what they'd lost, only about what came next. Mornings with coffee and cold feet, and sunlight through curtains, nights with fingers tangled and rain against the windows. Sometimes Rhea still woke up ready to fight, body tense for war, and Celeste would pull her back, whispering, "You're here. I'm here. You're safe." And Rhea would believe her a little more each time. One morning, months later, Rhea returned from work early, her hands rough with salt and oil, and found Celeste standing on the porch looking out at the water, her hair in the wind, her face calm. Rhea stood there watching something swelling in her chest to big, to raw, and said without thinking, "I love you." Celeste turned slowly, eyes wide and soft, and said, "You've never said that." And Rhea stepped closer. "I've never meant it like this before." And Celeste smiled the kind of smile that felt like sunrise, and said, "Then say it again." And Rhea did again and again until the words lost their sharpness and became something warm, something safe, something hers. For the first time, they weren't bodyguard and client, weren't prey and predator, weren't survivor and weapon. They were just Rhea and Celeste, bruised, healing, still learning, but free and in love. And for the first time ever, the silence wasn't dangerous. It was home. It started with a letter. There was no return address, no stamp, just a folded envelope slipped under the cabin door. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, deliberate. Rhea found it at dawn when she went to make coffee. She stared at it for a long time, heart slowing into something cold and familiar, the way it always had when danger changed its shape from bullets to silence. She opened it carefully, fingers steady. Despite the weight inside was a single line written in black ink. "You didn't bury all of us." No name, no threats, no blood, but it was enough. She stood there frozen, the kettle whistling behind her. Celeste came into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, sleep warm and soft, and said, "You're not moving." Rhea handed her the letter silently. Celeste read it once, twice, and looked up. "Is it him? I don't know. Is it someone from before?" "Yes." Rhea sat down slowly. "Someone survived. Someone who knows I'm alive and where I am. We were careful. Not careful enough. Do you think they're coming? If they are, they won't knock next time." Rhea's voice was calm, but her hands were already trembling. She hated this. She hated that peace was always temporary. Hated that the sound of Celeste's laugh might disappear again if she blinked too slow. She hated that love had made her weak and stronger at the same time. She looked at Celeste, then who hadn't backed away, who wasn't afraid, who stood in front of her like a wall of fire and said, "Then we fight again." Rhea reached for her hand. "No, I promised you peace. You promised me the truth. And this is part of you, and I want all of it. Even the danger, even the ghosts." Rhea swallowed. "You shouldn't have to fight anymore. Maybe not, but I want to, and I'll never let you fight alone." The next few days were a quiet storm. Rhea changed routines, adjusted routes. She used the old skills she had locked away for months, tracking patterns, listening for whispers. She found nothing, no name, no face, no confirmation. But she felt it the way animals feel the storm. Before it breaks, something was watching them, waiting. And so she prepared just like before. But this time, Celeste helped, willingly learned how to load weapons, how to disassemble cameras, how to read patterns. They trained at night in the open fields behind the cabin. No words, just movement, just breath, just the rhythm of survival. And Rhea found herself falling in love all over again. Not with the fire, but with the strength, with the way Celeste stood in front of her, and never once let her carry the weight alone. It wasn't long before they heard it again. A drone overhead, too small, too fast to be local. Rhea tracked it visually for 12 seconds before it vanished. And that night, a second letter arrived. This one marked with a fingerprint in ash inside. It read, "You still owe us something." And Rhea knew exactly what it meant. The ghosts hadn't died. They'd scattered. And now one of them was picking up the pieces, looking for the last thread of what used to be Rhea Maddox, the mercenary, the weapon, the executioner. And what she owed wasn't money or favors. It was herself, her identity, her silence, her surrender. And they would keep sending letters, or worse, until she gave it or until she bled. Rhea burned the letter without a word. But Celeste saw the shake in her jaw and pressed her hands to her cheeks. "Don't shut me out now. I don't know how to keep you safe this time," Rhea whispered. "What if I can't protect you again? Then we burn the world down together," Celeste said without hesitation. But I'm not running and I'm not hiding. And if they want to take you from me, they'd better be ready to die trying. Rhea kissed her then fiercely, like she needed to memorize her mouth in case everything disappeared. The next morning, Rhea made a decision. She sent a message through the old encrypted line, the one only 3 people in the world still knew. She didn't say her name. She only sent one phrase. "You want what's left of me? Come get it." Then she disabled the line for good when she turned around. Celeste was watching her from the doorway. She didn't speak, but she walked to her slowly, slid her arms around her waist, and pressed her forehead to Rhea's chest. "Whatever happens, we stay together. Even if we don't survive this, especially then." Rhea dipped her chin once and held her close. Outside, the wind screamed louder than it had in weeks, and Rhea understood the storm was coming. Not the kind you predict on a forecast or outlast by bolting a door, but the kind that rewrites everything, the kind that breaks and rebuilds in the same breath. In that instant, she wasn't afraid. Not of pain, not of loss, not even of dying. Because for the first time in her life, she had something real to fight for. Not revenge, not redemption, love. And that made her more dangerous than she had ever been. They arrived 3 days after the warning went out. Not under midnight, but at sunrise, bold, deliberate, as if they wanted her to watch them approach, to feel the certainty of it. Rhea caught them between the trees. 4 shapes moving in formation, dressed like locals, but not walking like them. Their motions were too sharp, too clean, too deliberate. And in that heartbeat, every instinct she'd buried surged back, feral, vicious, ready. Celeste stood at the window, arms folded, tracking them without blinking, without speaking, just waiting. Rhea checked the weapons one by one, loaded, oiled, laid out on the table like pieces of a life she never meant to return to, but now couldn't afford to abandon. They had reinforced the cabin in the days after the first letter braced the doors, shored the weaker panes, carved fallback routes through the cellar and escape trails across the forest. Rhea had taught Celeste how to breathe in silence, how to count footsteps, how to shoot to kill, and Celeste absorbed it all with terrifying grace, not because she wanted to harm anyone, but because she refused to be helpless again. Rhea watched her now with a kind of awe that tasted like mourning, like pride, rinsed in fear. She knew what was on its way and hated that she had carried it to this place. They were trying to turn into a life. "Are you ready?" Rhea asked without turning. Celeste answered, "I've been ready since the night I chose you." Rhea turned then, caught her by the waist, kissed her deep, fast, like a goodbye she didn't want to say, and whispered, "Whatever happens, I'll find you." "You don't have to," Celeste said. "I'm not leaving your side, Rhea. Stop treating me like something fragile. I'm not afraid to die if it's with—" Rhea looked at her with something sharp and desperate in her eyes. "But I am afraid of losing you." "Then don't." The first shot rang out at 6:04 a.m. It shattered the small window over the sink. Rhea moved at once, dragging Celeste behind the heavy wood counter, sending rounds back through the low angle. She heard movement outside, 2 on the left, one looping behind, one posted as lookout. She recognized the pattern because she'd designed it years ago, and now they were using her own methods against her. But they didn't know one thing. Celeste Whitmore wasn't collateral anymore. She was the weapon they hadn't accounted for. Rhea tossed smoke from the west side, curved around through the back door while Celeste held the position. Exactly as they'd practiced, gun raised, breath steady. No shaking now, no hesitation. The first man through never even saw her. She put one center mass just like Rhea taught her to aim, and he dropped instantly. Rhea reached the tree line, dropped the lookout with a knife to the thigh and a crack to the skull, then turned just in time to see a second operative breach the front door. She sprinted back faster than thought, but Celeste was already moving. She slammed the intruder hard, bounced his head off the floor once, twice, until he stopped breathing. Rhea reached her and froze blood across Celeste's shirt, scratches on her cheek, but eyes bright, electric, unstoppable. Are you okay? Rhea breathed. Better than okay, Celeste said, breathless. I finally feel in control. Rhea wanted to speak, to cry, to scream, but instead she kissed her. Hard, fierce, desperate. Then the last one dropped in, not through the door, but through the roof, cunning, ruthless. The kind of man Rhea remembered from the darkest corners of her history. He hit the boards with a thud, leveled at Rhea, and said, "You should have stayed buried." Rhea answered, "You should have stayed forgotten." They fought at close quarters, hands, fists, knees, while the world around them dissolved into sweat, fire, memory, and pain. Celeste tried to help, but Rhea waved her off. "This one's mine." And she meant it. It was a reckoning, a final purge, a way to sever the last cord tying her to the life that once owned her. She let the monster rise. When it was done, when the man lay broken and still at her feet, she stood there gasping, covered in blood, and stared at Celeste with unblinking eyes. "It's over," she said. Celeste stepped forward slowly, wrapped her arms around Rhea, ignoring blood, bruises, wreckage, and murmured, "No, it isn't over. Not until you let yourself come back to me." Rhea sank into her, at last shaking. Outside, light crept back across the broken boards, thin, patient, insistent, daring them to breathe again. Rhea closed her eyes, felt Celeste's pulse against her palm, and chose to stay, chose to live, chose her. The storm receded, not gone, but held at bay by a vow neither of them would break now. Finally, crying, finally, free, they burned the bodies that night in the woods. In silence, no words, just flames, and the sound of freedom crackling in the air. And when they returned to the cabin, Rhea sat by the fire with Celeste at her side and whispered, "I never thought I'd live long enough to be loved." And Celeste whispered back, "Then you better start getting used to it." They stayed there all night. No sleep, no fear, just the weight of survival and the lightness of still being alive together. And in that stillness, Rhea realized that maybe the past didn't need to be buried. Maybe it just needed to be faced and then left behind like smoke rising from a fire that no longer needed to burn. There's something no one tells you about survival. Not the part where you run, not the part where you fight, not even the part where when they don't tell you what it feels like. When the world finally goes quiet, when the war ends, when the shadows retreat, and there's no more blood to wash off and no more footsteps to chase, no more enemies to count when your hands are still for the first time in years. And suddenly you have to learn how to be someone without a weapon in them. And Rhea was terrible. Added, the silence was loud. The stillness was unbearable. Some nights she'd sit by the window for hours unmoving, just watching the trees sway, like ghosts of the people she'd left behind. She didn't speak much. Not even to Celeste. Not because she didn't want to, but because every word felt like breaking something open. And she was so tired of breaking. But Celeste didn't push. She waited quietly beside her, painting in the kitchen, humming while she worked, baking too much bread just to fill the air with a scent of something human. Sometimes she'd crawl into Rhea's lap without warning, just settle there, wrap herself around her, and whisper, "You're here. You're safe. I'm not going anywhere." And sometimes Rhea would just hold her like she was the only thing keeping her from vanishing into herself completely. And maybe she was. Some nights they made love slowly, like it was the only language left that didn't hurt. Like saying, "I'm still here. I still choose you. I still want this," over and over again. And when Rhea cried, Celeste never looked away, never pulled back. Just kissed her face like those tears were sacred, like they proved she was still alive, like it was an honor to see her come undone. And some nights Rhea woke up screaming, and Celeste would just hold her tighter, whispering, "You came back to me. You're safe. You came back." And in time the screaming eased, the dream loosened, and the fire inside her stopped scorching everything it touched. They began going into town again. Small errands first, groceries, fuel, then the bookshop where Celeste started teaching a local art class. Rhea stayed close, always watchful, always on alert. But little by little her body unclenched. She stopped reaching for her knife whenever a door opened. Once, she even smiled when a little girl at the market told her she looked like a superhero. Celeste saw it and squeezed her hand hard, like she'd been waiting for that tiny miracle for months. And maybe she had. One evening they sat on the porch under a single blanket, watching the sun slip behind the hills. Celeste asked softly, "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Rhea was silent a long time before saying, "I don't know how to think that far. I've never lived a life with a next only now." And Celeste looked at her with eyes full of light and heat and love and said, "Then let's build it one now at a time." And Rhea nodded, because maybe that's what healing really was. Not a grand revelation, not a dramatic turning point. Maybe it was just waking each day choosing to try again, to love again, to stay again. Eventually Rhea started speaking more. She told Celeste about her childhood, about the first time she held a weapon, about the first time she wanted to run. She told her about the operation that broke her, the one that made her quit, the one that still haunted her. And Celeste didn't flinch. She listened, held her, and kissed her after, as if the truth made her more real, not less. Then one morning Rhea woke before Celeste and watched her sleep. Hair messy, mouth slightly open, hand curled on the pillow like always. And something clicked inside her, something she didn't have a name for. Something terrifying and beautiful and undeniable. She whispered at first, afraid to speak too loud, like it might shatter if it echoed. "I want to marry you." She hadn't meant to say it, at least not like that, not while Celeste slept. But the words were true and heavy and warm, and for the first time in her life, they didn't feel like a chain. They felt like a doorway, like a beginning. Celeste stirred slowly, blinked up at her, and smiled, still drowsy. "What did you just say?" Rhea froze. "Nothing. Go back to sleep." But Celeste was awake now, sitting up, gaze fixed on hers as Rhea said, "I said I want to marry you." For a moment she thought she'd ruined everything too fast, too broken, too raw. But Celeste laughed, a soft bright sound that melted every shard of fear in Rhea's chest, and said, "Then ask me properly." Rhea stared, stunned. Right now, right now. So Rhea slid out of bed, heart pounding, dropped to one knee like she'd seen in films, and reached for Celeste's hand. "I never had a future before you. I never thought I'd live long enough to want one. But I do now, and it's only because of you. So if you'll have me, if you'll stay, if you'll keep waking beside me every day, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." Celeste whispered, "Yes, yes, yes," before Rhea even finished. They laughed and cried and kissed in the early light, wrapped in each other, and something that finally felt like peace, like a life, like love. And maybe the world would never know their names, or what they survived, or how many times they almost didn't make it. But in that cabin, in that small corner of the world where no one cared who they had been, Rhea Maddox and Celeste Whitmore were finally writing the first page of a story, with nothing to do with pain and everything to do with choosing each other again and again and again. It wasn't the proposal that scared Rhea. It wasn't the ring, or the idea of vows, or even the steady look in Celeste's eyes when she said yes. It was the aftermath, the quiet, the waiting, the soft in between, when nothing hunted them yet everything still felt fragile, like if she blinked too long, it would all vanish, and she'd wake alone again, gunpowder on her skin, with no one left to hold. But Celeste never let her fall back into that place, not fully. She pulled her out, every time with laughter, with touch, with small notes tucked in books or in her coat pocket. "You're mine, I'm yours, breathe." She planned the wedding like she paints, wildly, fearlessly, with no regard for tradition or perfection, just truth and beauty and color. It would be small, just the two of them and a witness, somewhere the world couldn't find. They didn't need music or flowers or family, just hands and breath and the words "I do." Even so, Rhea struggled, not because she didn't want it, but because she did. because she wanted it more than anything, more than safety, more than sleep, more than the quiet or certainty. And wanting had never led to anything but loss in her life before she found herself waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, reaching for weapons that weren't there, whispering Celeste's name just to make sure she was still breathing. And every time Celeste would stir, slide closer, press her lips to Ria's temple, and whisper, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." And Ria would bury her face in her neck and try to believe it on. A Tuesday morning, just 6 weeks before the wedding, Ria went into town to pick up some supplies alone. It was a normal thing, a safe thing, something she'd done dozens of times. But that day, something felt off. She couldn't name exactly, just a shift in the air, in the way people looked at her too long. Or not long enough. The way the man at the market said nothing when he usually joked. The way the woman at the post office gave her a letter even though she hadn't asked for one, a small envelope, plain but addressed to Ria Maddox. No one knew that name here, no one except one person, and Ria's chest clenched tight. She opened it. Right there in the middle of the street inside was a single photograph. It was old, blurred, but unmistakable. It was her years ago on a rooftop after a mission, blood on her boots, rifle in hand, and across the back someone had scrolled one word: run. Ria stood frozen for a full minute before folding it carefully and tucking it away. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She just walked home faster than usual, fingers twitching the whole time. When she got back, Celeste was painting her hands speckled with green and gold, and she looked up smiling until she saw Ria's face, and her own expression shifted immediately. "What happened?" Ria handed her the photo, said nothing for a beat. Then finally, "Someone knows. Do you think it's a warning or a threat?" "Maybe both." "Do you think they're here?" "No. If they were, they'd already be inside." "So, what do we do?" Ria looked at her hands covered in paint and said softly, "We get married anyway." And Celeste exhaled slowly. "You still want to?" "I want to more than ever. Even if it's dangerous, especially if it is." They didn't cancel. They didn't postpone. They just moved the ceremony to a new location deeper into the countryside, where even the trees didn't know their names. It rained the morning of the wedding. Not harsh, just gentle, steady. Like the sky knew they needed something clean, something soft. Ria wore black because she didn't own anything else, and Celeste wore white because she wanted to. And when Ria saw her walk across the field barefoot, wet hair, eyes glowing, she forgot how to breathe. "You're unreal," she whispered, and Celeste smiled. "So are you." The officiant was an old woman who barely spoke English, but smiled like she understood everything. And when they stood hand in hand and said their vows, they didn't need poetry. They didn't need grand declarations. They just spoke quietly, like a secret they were giving only to each other. Ria said, "I've lived in the dark most of my life, but you pulled me out, not with light, but with your hands, with your love. And I promise I will never run from you. No matter what comes, I will always choose you." And Celeste said, "I used to think safety meant being alone because no one could hurt me. But you made me understand that love doesn't make me weak. It makes me brave. And I choose you, Ria, every day, every breath, every moment." And when they kissed, it wasn't delicate or restrained. It was deep and real and shaking. And when they pulled apart, neither of them could stop smiling. And that night, they didn't sleep. They didn't even try. They lay naked under the covers, bodies, tangled skin, flushed fingers, roaming like rediscovery, like worship. And Ria whispered, "I'm yours now forever, no matter who comes, no matter what they try." And Celeste said, "Then let them come, because they'll never take you from me." And Ria believed her, not because the world was safe, but because they weren't afraid anymore. They were in love. They were together. And for now, for this breath, for this night, it was enough. They stayed in the cabin for 2 weeks after the wedding, not because they were hiding, but because they couldn't bear to be anywhere else. The world outside didn't exist in those days. only skin and silence. And the way Rhea would wake up already reaching for Celeste. Like, she'd never get used to the fact that she was real and warm. And hers they cooked when they remembered to eat. When they were hungry, laughed without reason, kissed, constantly touched like they were still proving the other was alive. Rhea stopped reaching for weapons in her sleep and started reaching for Celeste's thigh. Instead, murmuring half sentences into her skin, words like always and mine and thank you, Celeste. Painted her everywhere, on napkins, on walls, on the windows, on Rhea's bare back, with the tips of her fingers, like she was learning her all over again. And maybe she was. They didn't talk about the photo or the threat or the way Rhea still checked the cameras every morning. They didn't have to. It was always there, but it had no power anymore. Not over the way Rhea kissed her shoulder while pouring coffee, or the way Celeste's voice softened when she read aloud just for the sound of it. And when they finally made it into town again, hand in hand, wearing matching rings, no one said anything, no one needed to, because something about them together was enough of a story. Peace never arrives without a price. And the final bill came one night as a stranger. He reached the cabin just after midnight. Didn't knock, didn't speak, just stood at the tree line, waiting. Rhea felt him before she saw him. She stepped out slowly, barefoot, pulse steady. She didn't bring a gun. Not tonight. She didn't need one. He was tall, dressed like a man who could disappear on demand, neither military nor corporate. Nothing obvious, which made it worse. He looked at her like she wasn't a threat, just an inevitability. You're hard to find, he said. Not hard enough, apparently, she replied. I'm not here to hurt you. No one is, until they are. A faint smile. I'm not here for you, at least not directly. I'm here to deliver a message from someone who used to own you. They all thought they owned me. This one still does. And he's not thrilled about your vanishing act or the people you left behind. There's no one left behind. There's always someone. He drew something from his coat and tossed it between them. A burner phone. Black. Cheap. It buzzed once, screen flaring. Rhea didn't pick it up, but the name was plain enough. Deacon Ward. The codename turned her stomach. Not just anyone. Him, the one who trained Ronan Pike, who signed the order on Rhea's last mission. The one who forged her into a blade and expected her to die clean. He was supposed to be dead. Fire, intel, betrayal. She'd buried him in memory and blood. Apparently ghosts keep their own rules. Rhea bent, lifted the phone, answered without a word. His voice was exactly as she remembered, calm, cultured, tipped with poison. Rhea Maddox, married? Domestic life doesn't suit you. It suits me fine. You killed Ronan Pike. He tried to kill me first. He was loyal. So was I once. You owe me. I don't owe you a damn thing. You owe me her. Rhea froze. What? Celeste Whitmore. She was on our list. You intercepted her years ago and kept her for yourself. She was never only a client. She was a target, elusive, and the daughter of someone very dangerous and very foolish. Rhea's blood went cold. You're lying. Check the file I sent to that phone if you dare. Everything about her is there. And now she's your weakness and mine. And I don't share. Rhea cut the call. She didn't open the file. Didn't glance at the man among the trees. She turned, went inside, found Celeste awake under a blanket, reading on the floor. Rhea looked at her for a long time, and something split so wide it shook her knees. Celeste looked up, smiled. You okay? Rhea nodded, voice rough. I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. All of it, no matter what. Celeste's face sharpened in an instant. Okay. Do you know who your father really was? The silence that followed was thick enough to choke them. At last Celeste whispered, yes. Rhea's heart stopped. And you didn't tell me because I didn't want it to define me. Not with you. Not here. Not after everything. They think you're leverage. They think you're unfinished business. I was leverage my whole life until I met you. Rhea dropped to her knees. They're coming for you now, not me. And I don't know if I can protect you again. You don't have to protect me this time. Just stand with me. This isn't like before. Not mercenaries or ghosts. It's him. He built this. He trained Ronan Pike. He trained me. He knows my moves before I make them. Then stop moving like you used to and move like we do now. Rhea laughed, bitter. What if I don't know how? Celeste touched her cheek. Then we'll learn together. They didn't sleep. They planned. They packed. They moved like shadows again, only this time together. Always within reach. Always touching. As if letting go would mean vanishing. Rhea opened the file when Celeste wasn't looking. Names, photos, dates, links. All true. It didn't matter. It changed nothing. She'd already chosen her, already vowed. Already burned everything else for her. If the one called Deacon Ward wanted a war, he'd have it, but he wouldn't win. Not now. Not when Rhea had something to lose and someone willing to lose everything with her. The last time Rhea prepared for war, she was alone, nameless, a weapon held together by duty, blood, and silence. This time was different. This time she had something to lose and someone who refused to let her fight blind. She and Celeste moved through the cabin like a single thought, sharpening, loading, sensing. Rhea taught her in whispers, pressure points, blind spots, silent signals. And Celeste learned fast. Not out of fear, but out of love and fury and defiance. They set traps, rerouted. The cameras backed up the generator. Reinforced the walls with things no one else would know how to use. Because Rhea was no longer the prey. No longer the one running. She was the one drawing the line. And Deacon Ward had no idea who she'd become. The first sign came 3 nights later. A sound too clean to be an animal. A metallic click against stone. Rhea sat up instantly, breathing already slowed, body already shifting into battle mode. Celeste woke. Seconds later. Hand already on hers, eyes calm like she'd been born in this moment, like they both had. Rhea whispered, "Stay close. Don't hesitate." And Celeste replied. Always the first shot came through the window. A distraction. Rhea didn't flinch. She pulled Celeste down, moved to the opposite wall, and fired back twice. Not to kill, just to scatter. Then silence. A voice followed. Smooth, mocking. Too familiar. Rhea hailed the prodigal returns with a wedding ring. How poetic. Rhea didn't answer. She moved like shadow, eyes tracking heat signatures, counting steps. She knew his rhythm because he had built hers. And now she would use that against him. You broke protocol. You took the asset. You vanished like a ghost with a stolen heart. Deacon Ward said from somewhere behind the trees. I should thank you for making it so easy to find you. I didn't break protocol. Rhea finally said, her voice low and hard. I burned it to the ground. You were my best, he replied. And now she could hear the approach from the east to flanking one behind the cabin. And now you'll die for a woman who is always just leverage. She's not leverage. Rhea said, she's the reason I'm still human. And then everything happened at once. Flash bangs through the back door. Automatic gunfire spraying the east wall. While Celeste didn't scream, she moved just like they planned, grabbing the remote detonator for the claymore set near the side entrance and waiting. 1, 2, 3 boom, dust screams. Rhea was already outside, weaving through smoke to down one injured to more still approaching. Deacon Ward was among them. She could feel him, smell his presence like blood in the water. Rhea circled back, made it into the tree line, shot one in the thigh, broke the other's jaw, then turned as a figure through the smoke. Slow, deliberate. Deacon Ward, unarmed, smiling. This isn't who you are, he said, and Rhea laughed once, dark and bitter. You don't get to tell me who I am anymore. You think love redeems you? No, she said. It reveals me. He moved fast suddenly, a blade in his hand, and she caught it with her forearm. Pain shooting witty it. But she didn't stop. She slammed her fist into his throat, kneed his ribs. They crashed to the ground, brutal, close, suffocating. And Celeste saw it through the smoke, running toward them, screaming, Rhea. Deacon Ward looked up. eyes cold and cruel, and smiled. There she is, your weakness. And he raised the blade toward Celeste. But Rhea moved like instinct, like fire, her body between them, catching the blade in her shoulder, taking him down with a scream she hadn't let out in years. And then it was over. Deacon Ward lying broken beneath her, Rhea bleeding and shaking, and Celeste dropping to her knees beside her, hands covered in blood. Rhea, stay with me. Stay with me. Rhea smiled despite the pain. I'm not going anywhere, I told you. Remember, always. Sirens in the distance. Not police. Not enemies. Nova Calder had come through. She'd sent a signal earlier just in case. Extraction, backup, safety this time. Not for escape, but for cleanup and protection. Rhea was fading, but Celeste held her like an anchor, whispering everything she needed to hear, everything they hadn't said yet. You saved me before I ever knew I needed saving. You gave me a reason to want tomorrow. I love you. I love you. I love you. And Rhea whispered back, you're my reason, too. Before closing her eyes, not in death, not in surrender, but in rest. 3 days later, Rhea woke up in a secured medical facility. Sunlight pouring and through tall windows, bandages tight, pain sharp. But distant Celeste asleep in a chair, head resting on her hand, still in the same clothes, eyes rimmed, red. Rhea reached for her, couldn't quite move, and whisper her name once, twice. And when Celeste woke up and saw her, she didn't speak. She just broke into tears and laughter and climbed into the bed carefully and held her close. And Rhea let herself cry for the first time in years, for the war, the pain, the survival. And the miracle of still having someone to come back to. Deacon Ward was dead, his network exposed, thanks to the data Rhea had buried years ago, and finally released. They were safe, not just hidden, but free. And weeks later, when Rhea could walk again, they returned to the cabin together. The walls still held the echo of fire, but now they also held the scent of new beginnings. Rhea planted wildflowers along the fence. Celeste painted the front door gold. And one morning, over coffee and silence, Rhea said, I dreamed of a life like this once, and it didn't feel real. And Celeste smiled, kissed her knuckles, and replied, then let's keep making it real every day. And they did, not perfectly, not painlessly, but wholly fiercely, with laughter and fighting and holding and choosing every single day. Because love wasn't the end of their story. It was the war they won to begin it. If you enjoyed this content and want to support the channel in a special way, try clicking the thanks button below. It's the one with the heart and $sign icon. With super thanks, you can make a direct contribution to the channel, which helps me keep creating awesome videos for you.